Hello, friends, and welcome to the Reclamation Podcast. I'm your host, Megan Colleen Johnson, and I'm here to guide us in raw conversations about thriving in life and work, so that together we can step into personal agency and stop letting life happen to us. We'll cover topics like health, boundaries, communication, finances, and worthiness. That badass business you've been dreaming of, it's not so far off. The desire to wake up feeling fully alive, it's right around the corner. All right. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I am recording from my office today. I have a seltzer water in front of me. It is a beautiful, hot summer, sunny day. Yeah, I'm feeling really good and really settled. It's a Friday, so I'm also just really excited for the weekend ahead. And today I have on this call with me Jennie Kerns, and Jennie is a certified health coach who specializes in talking about menstrual cycles. Jennie is passionate about helping women and uterus-bodied humans understand and connect with their body and ending the stigma that surrounds that time of the month. She's super laid back and full of knowledge. Her whole vibe is deep, but make it comedic. So Jennie, I'm so excited. I feel like this is one of the most unique topics that I've had on the podcast so far, and I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am recording from my office as well, and I have some water and tea in front of me.
Awesome. I love that. And I think I wanted to circle back briefly because I think it's almost interesting that I have to say that it's unique, this topic that we're diving into, because I feel like that's some of the whole point of why you coach around this, because you want to end the stigma of it being unique, of the topic of periods and menstrual cycles being kind of taboo in some ways. And I think that it's significantly less than it used to be, but it still is like, it's a little bit unique to be talking about menstrual cycles on a podcast. So
yeah, it is. It's interesting and kind of a fun little experiment for me to see how people react when I tell them what I do. And it's wild to me that it is still somehow taboo. It's 2020, but I really enjoy doing this work. And I do a lot of it because of my own story and my own experience.
Yeah. And I'm really excited to dive into that a little bit, because you're going to share a little bit of your reclamation story and kind of what that was for you. So for everyone listening today, our primary topic is 3 ways to reclaim your cycle. So as we're diving into your story and as we are chatting through the topic today, I'm just kind of excited to see how this all fits in. So I would love if you could share, like, what is your story? How did you start? And what did you really have to reclaim to step into this work that you do?
So growing up, I was very, very disconnected from my body. When I did get my first period, it was a very shameful experience of like starting it when I think I was a freshman, because I was a late bloomer. I was a freshman and I didn't even know that I had started bleeding until like someone told me at lunch. And it was so embarrassing. It like traumatized me so much that I still remember the outfit that I was wearing. And this was, years ago, and I ended up going to the school nurse and like convincing her to let me go home because I was too embarrassed to tell her as well. So that first experience also fuels a lot of me doing this work, because I want to decrease that happening to other young girls or humans that have uteruses. And so that was my first period. And then because I was so disconnected from my body, I barely paid attention to my period. And I didn't even know that taking like pain medication was a thing. I remember there was a youth group retreat that I was in, and I don't know, like, if I made a face, I probably just was making a painful face, and my youth pastor's wife could tell that I was in pain, and she asked me what was going on. And I, was like, didn't want to say, but I was like, I'm on my period. And she pulled out some Midol, and I was like, what? There's pain medication for periods? So that's an example of like how little I knew.
Yeah.
And at that age. So then Fast forward some years, and I attended IIN, the Institute of Integrated Nutrition, which is where I became a health coach. And when I was deciding what to specialize in, because of the stories that I just told you, I knew that I wanted to focus, learn, and coach on the entire realm of the lack of knowledge around women's cycles. And at the same time that I was attending IIN, I was also reevaluating a lot of what I believed faith-wise.
Yeah.
I left a lot of my former beliefs, and in doing so, I found that I was able to not disassociate from my body anymore because I didn't believe verses that talked about how sinful our bodies are. So that whole deconstruction also played a part in kind of momentum as far as me wanting to do this work, because I was much more willing and open to actually learn about how my body worked and take care of my body, because I no longer thought it was evil. And in that, I awakened in a sense, and I wanted to honor my body. Other things that led me to talking about periods and doing this kind of coaching work is that shameful first period, an awful pap smear experience, like really heavy bleeding, and having to navigate choosing the best type of birth control. And much of my, because obviously I didn't go to OBGYN until I was like, honestly, in my mid-20s. And during those experiences, which most of them were poor, it reminded me of how little education there is. Like even when I was choosing a birth control with my OBGYN, she really didn't give me that. I mean, she gave me, all the options, but it was pretty surface level.
Yeah, I know. I remember that same kind of thing with my experience. Like they give you, like, there's a few different things that they tell you about, but there's not a lot of detail into like, well, why does this work? Why might this be a good solution for me? And what could be the possible ramifications of this type of birth control? And it was just so surface level, like, oh, I think this is going to work because this is a little bit of a lighter dose. I'm like, okay, well, what does that actually mean? Like, great. I don't understand. Like, tell me more.
Yeah. Like, didn't mention any side effects or anything like that. It was very much so like, this is what this is, and this is what it should do.
Yeah. So I would love to circle back to a couple of things from your story, if that's okay. I know a big part of so much of reclamation and kind of what I have learned on my journey is the ability to deconstruct from things. It's the ability to, peel back our conditioning and the different layers that we've learned from parents and from society. And I'm curious if you would be willing to share a little bit more about how your journey was with that, specifically as you developed a brand new like relationship with your body, because that's almost it's reclamation, but for us, like, we're reclaiming our bodies, but in many ways it's a brand new introduction to our bodies. And specifically, I guess I'm just curious how that experience was from being disconnected to your body to then suddenly being more connected. I feel like that's such a difficult process, at least in my own journey. That's been a very unique and longer process. And I'd love if you could dive into that more.
Yeah, it definitely was not like one day I was disconnected and the next day I deconstructed all of those beliefs and I was like, yay, my body. It was really difficult. So part of realizing that my body wasn't sinful was I had left the church and I didn't have those messages like constantly coming my way. And it was really difficult when I started like actually connecting with my body, because I had a lot of shame spirals because, especially with things like sex, I would feel pleasure and then I would just go into a massive shame spiral because I was still deconstructing what I was brought up to learn. And it was obviously like I'm not perfect at it. and there's still work to do, personal work for me to do. But I found that what was really helpful was, like I said, honestly, not attending church. That was a large reason of why I had to leave church, was because like every Sunday they were talking about how bad it was to have sex before marriage. And I also was really shamed by someone that I know who thought I was being sexually active when I actually wasn't. And this person identified as a Christian. And ooh, it was tough. So it was eliminating those messages and really replacing that with messages about like that I am worthy, my body is worthy of pleasure, my body is good, and like actually communicating with my body, like doing some self-talk with my body. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that
You're welcome.
these conversations are definitely a very vulnerable space. And for people listening, please know, like, if this is too much for you, like and it just feels like a lot of emotions are hitting you, please feel free to skip on to the next episode. But if this does resonate with you, I want you to just know that you're definitely not alone in your experience. I know, similar to your experience, I feel like for me, I've had to work through so much shame. And it's just so interesting how, for me, my husband and I actually didn't kiss before marriage. We went to that extent.
Wow.
It was such a difficult process to start becoming more embodied and to be more connected with my body, and to have conversations even around that. Because again, like at that time, I only started kind of deconstructing from this a couple of years ago. So I've been married for going on 5 years. So I was married for about 3 years, still living in a very, very strong Christian belief. And I felt like for me, I didn't even know that it was okay to ask those questions still, that it was okay to be like, okay, like, how can I be really good at sex and be really good with my body when like, I feel like I can't even talk to my body. Like, so for listeners, just know that like wherever you're at, like I know everyone's story is different. And this episode isn't specifically about Christianity, but I think many of us grow up with different beliefs. And even in mental health in general, I feel like it's a very recent switch to go from making decisions from our head to actually feeling into our body. And that's really what this conversation is about, of like, how can we connect with our bodies? And as women and as humans with uteruses, how can we really lean into our flow and to live from a place of love and acceptance and celebration? Do you have any thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that a lot of times I end up also, which people may not have realized when they started listening to this podcast, but I also end up talking about sex because it was having sexual experiences brought up all that shame. And that was a huge part of also like me wanting to talk about periods, because it all has to do with your body. It all has to do with acceptance and acknowledging that you have a body, first of all, which might seem like, how could you not acknowledge that? But for me, I realized while I was deconstructing and sometime after that it's very easy to, like I've said, disassociate from your body when you are in religious spaces that are saying that your body is bad.
Yeah. You're kind of taught that your body is just what you're in, but your soul is kind of different versus being a complete and whole human. Yeah. Step into and to start becoming more unified with our bodies and with our flow and with our menstrual cycles. So do you have any empowering tips that people can dive into and that they can implement?
Yeah. So first of all, track your cycle. There are a lot of free apps out there, also some paid apps, but some apps that you can use are MyFlow, Moody, Glow, Clue, and there's several others. I personally use Clue and Moody. Moody is really neat because you can actually, as the title indicates, you can track your moods. And I simply started all of this by tracking my own cycle with Clue, because before tracking, I couldn't see any patterns in my emotions and waves of wanting to be social and then wanting to hibernate. So when I first started tracking, I was able to see like, oh, on day 20 of my cycle, where I'm between what I would call your summer season and fall season. So my body is getting ready slowly to start its next bleed. After I started tracking, I was able to see like, oh, day 20 is the day that I often will start a fight with my partner. And it's because hormones are shifting in my body and they are starting to lower. The hormones are starting to decline, I should say. So yeah, the first step would be to track your cycle. I know that some people also literally just use like pen and paper, and that practically looks like just logging into an app every day or getting out a piece of paper and saying how you feel. It's also good to possibly track your like cervical mucus, which might sound a little weird. There are some methods of non-hormonal birth control that you literally will log the consistency of your cervical mucus, because that can tell you if you're ovulating or not, and it tells you where you are in your cycle. And that, what I just referred to, is known as FAM, fertility awareness method. Ironically, sometimes it does create a family though, because you know, it's a very like nitpicky way of tracking. Nothing against people who do it. I tried to do it myself and found that it was time consuming and it made me anxious because it wasn't like a for sure thing. And you track your basal body temperature like first thing in the morning and other things. So
yeah.
Tracking things like your cervical mucus, your mood, your productivity level, digestion issues, if you were feeling social or if you wanted to just hang out alone. And then once you get into a rhythm of being able to track, once you've done that for a couple months, you should see patterns and you should be able to tell where your phases end and where they start, which leads me into the second point of knowing the 4 phases or seasons. So there are like medical terms for each phase. I think that they can be a little confusing to remember. So recently I've been shifting the language to saying that we have a winter, spring, summer, and fall season in our cycle. To get more specific, winter is your actual period where you're bleeding. And often we want to hibernate, and it's a time to focus on yourself and allow your partner or partners to take care of you. Then the spring season is, I often feel like I'm coming out of my period cave. Your hormones, like I come out of my period cave and I'm like, oh, I want to talk to people again. Also during the spring, your hormone levels are slowly rising and you'll probably feel creative. Then during the summer, you might feel like a social butterfly. Your hormones are at their peak. Also, testosterone is at the highest during that time. And this is where ovulation occurs. Ovulation can be really fun for some people, but then for others, they will have ovulation cramps. So also want to point out that it's totally fine if during your summer phase, it's totally fine if that's like a great time for you. It's totally okay if it's also not a great time. And then during the fall season, you have what's called improvement brain because of the hormone levels, which also could be, why you start fights. It's probably why I have started majority of fights during my fall phase. Improvement brain, it means like you are able to see where things can be improved, which very simple. There's also a lot of times like people will kind of nest during the fall phase because you're kind of trying to clean everything. And there's also a low tolerance for BS, and there can be like truth telling in the fall.
Totally. I know that when I first started diving into noticing my body, and I was working with a chiropractor at the time, and that was something that I really noticed was in my like fall season, almost into the winter season, I would really notice like things that I'm like, this is just not working for me, and I would try and like call it out. And I noticed as well that it's not always, at least for me, it was not always the best time to take action on like what I was noticing, but writing them down, like this was just for me, for my personal process. I just found like if I wrote them down and kind of felt into like, okay, well, what would actually be a good way to approach these? Because now that I'm aware of them, like I think that was really, really great, because I noticed, oh, okay, like my brain is really good at calling out BS during this time. Let me write it down. Let me make sure that I feel into then the next action step that I should be taking, potentially not in this season, but maybe in the spring, or maybe later on in my winter season. That was just something that I noticed. Also, like this is just like a thing for me. When I was starting to keep track of my cycle a little bit more, I was fighting migraines. And when I started tracking my cycle, I was also able to recognize a couple things. First of all, my migraines, some of them were because of stress. And then the second thing was I would experience significantly like worse migraines right before my period would start. And I think that I can't remember if it was right before my period would start or right at the end, when my estrogen levels were highest and my body wasn't able to process all of them. Is that at the beginning?
Well, so at the end, in the fall phase, what initiates the start of your next period is all your hormones fall to the lowest level. So the peak of your estrogen would typically be in ovulation in the summer.
Okay. So maybe it was right before fall then.
Yeah, it could have been.
When I would get them. I'm not remembering exactly. It was a little while ago. I have it more under control now, and they're all like balanced and my stress levels are less. But that's the other piece of it that I was able to recognize, because stress causes your hormones to get all out of whack. And so then by bringing my stress levels down, I was able to address my migraines. But it all started with noticing my cycle. So I think that that's another really cool thing about our bodies as women and as humans with uteruses, is that if we're having some pain points in different areas, tracking our cycle can actually help us get to the root level of some of those things in a really empowering way.
Yeah, and what you just I'm going to circle back to you just talking about migraines when your estrogen was highest. So that's an example of someone being in their summer phase / like ovulation time, and it not being a pleasant experience. And I'm just going to confirm that. So what's happening with your hormones during that phase is there's a peak of estrogen and testosterone, and progesterone soars like super high. And estrogen specifically first dips and then it increases. So during that increase of estrogen in your summer phase, that probably was when you were getting those migraines.
Yeah. And I know for me, something that I was able to track as well was because you're in that phase, your estrogen, I feel like we're getting into such nitty gritty details, but it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Your estrogen and progesterone are supposed to kind of be at the same place, right?
It's going to be a little bit higher than estrogen and testosterone.
Okay. Because I think that was something else my chiropractor and I were able to work with, is for a season, my progesterone was not high enough. And so I was able to use a natural progesterone to also just help rebalance things. And eventually I didn't have to use, I don't have to use that anymore. But that was an issue for me, as my progesterone was not high enough.
I gotcha. Yeah. And the opposite of if your body is producing really high levels of progesterone, the body doesn't ovulate. That's the opposite of what you experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for a second, I was like, I wonder if her progesterone levels were high enough that she didn't ovulate after she started taking that medication. But
yeah, I think I love it. And I think that overall with these more detailed conversations, I think it just opens up the door for how much we don't know and how much opportunity there is for internal healing with our cycles. And so I love that we're kind of getting into some of these details, even though like it may not be the same for everyone listening, and your levels may be totally different. Likely ours will be in different places, but it is still a really cool thing to recognize that these things are happening in our body, and we don't always learn about them as much as we should.
Yeah. And that's like part of the stigma is, I mean, I haven't heard this in a while. I'm sure that there are some people still saying it, but messages around like, oh, women are so crazy on their period, or they're so crazy before their period. And it's like, that's pretty false. And there are simply hormonal changes happening. Like women are not crazy. Yeah. Like during the fall, right before you bleed, some people might see that as like, being nitpicky because you are able to see where things need to be fixed. Like that's not a nitpicky thing. That's a beautiful thing to be able to have what I said earlier, improvement brain, which, side note, is caused by the presence of progesterone. Like that's so cool, because if you are in like a partnership or any of your relationships, you're able to look and see where things could be improved, and you're able to sometimes speak up for yourself more and set boundaries. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know, like that's kind of what happened for me is during those seasons, I would try to speak up more. And this was actually when I was in a situation that wasn't awesome. And I would try to speak up and then be told that I was emotional and be told that I need to kind of get things under control. But then once I figured out what was happening, it was like, oh, I get it. Like, actually, this is kind of a superpower that my body's trying to tell me this is not working. My body's like using this season to say, hey, you need to call BS. And I would try to calm it down, or like I would try to, tuck that voice away. And that's where I did learn to write things down. And I did learn a few things to help me with that and to trust that voice in a different way. But ultimately, I had to learn to trust that voice instead of just stifle it, which I think, again, knowing these seasons in a lot of ways, it gives us permission to be ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know you had a final step, which I think we've kind of been talking about in some ways, but.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So the final third step is to work with your cycle. What I try to do is plan ahead. Like if I am going to be, recording a podcast like today, or if I'm going to be doing an Instagram live with someone, I look at my calendar and I look at the app Clue, and I'm like, where am I going to be in my cycle? Because I know that when I'm in my spring and summer phase, I'm so much more open to having like public conversations. And so I will try to plan things for then, because I have accidentally, before I was aware of my cycle, and obviously pre-COVID, hung out with people. And I'm like, this is not fun. It's so draining. And that was because I was about to start my next period. It's like, I feel totally different about hanging out with people when I'm in my summer phase.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
It definitely, just having a knowledge of the seasons, I think is so beneficial. And that's where, like, I love how you're using winter, spring, summer, fall, because I feel like it's easier to automatically understand as well. Just be like, oh, I'm in my winter. Like, that's a hibernation time. Like, it feels good to just be alone. And that's so beautiful. So I'm curious, I actually have a question I'm going to spring on you that I did not prepare you for. So we can always edit this question out. But I know, especially towards the beginning of our conversation, we chatted through, like, we've gotten into a lot of more nitpicky things with your period. But at the beginning, we did talk a lot about disassociation from your body and sex and that process. And I'm curious, like, outside of women reconnecting to their bodies, like, do you have any tips or suggestions for any men listeners out there, or the partners, like the men partners of people listening, or, whoever it may end up, getting a hold of this podcast, who identify as men? Do you have any tips for them as they are reclaiming their body, as they're building that relationship with their body, and with sex? Because there's so much stigma for men as well.
I thought at first when I was first listening. I thought maybe it would be like tips for men with partners who are having cycles.
You could dive into both.
Okay. I'll dive into both. So tips for, and obviously, like, I don't want to say men and women all the time because obviously there are ranges outside of that. So
yeah,
we'll say that if someone is listening to this and they have a partner who bleeds, or totally fine if they don't bleed, if they still have a cycle, because even if someone who is uterus-bodied does not bleed, they still are affected by hormones. All that to say, if you do have a partner who has a cycle, tips that I would give are to, I mean, of course, always listen to them and be open to them if they're wanting to talk about their cycle and hormones. I know that my own partner has obviously gotten really used to these conversations, and I think that he has a pretty good idea of the phases. I've quizzed him before and he's learned. So mainly listening and taking really good care of your partner when they are bleeding and giving them space to be alone, and like taking their word for if they are like, I just want to hang out by myself today. I think that I feel like I'm in my fall phase, because I for sure spend a lot of time, much more time alone, especially in my fall season. The other question, I know for men, this conversation about bodies happens a lot less.
Yeah.
But I think that I would still give similar advice in regards to be mindful of the messages that you're listening to around men's bodies. Like, even if you're watching a cologne commercial where the man has like where he's got a 6-pack abs, and of course the commercial is trying to make you think that if you buy the cologne, you're going to be ripped and you will get the woman of your dreams. And just being aware that that is very cultural, and you do not have to have abs. So being aware of messaging and tuning into your body to see how you feel, because there's also a message in society of like, oh, men want sex all the time, which, and if a man tunes into his body and he's like, I don't think that I want to engage in intimacy right now, then that's something to listen to and to honor.
Yeah,
I think that's what I would say.
Totally. Yeah. And I know for my husband, for my partner, he has really done a lot of work as well, just integrating his feminine side, trying to kind of come in touch with that. And so for him, it's been more so reconnecting to his feminine in a similar way. I guess, like as women, we're trying to connect to our feminine, we're trying to connect to our like empowered feminine selves. And for men, it's just kind of that, it's like the yin and the yang from what I understand, just like allowing all parts of yourself to be welcomed. Well, thank you so much. And I know like I threw that question at you there without any prep. So
that's okay. That's a great question.
Awesome. So as we're wrapping up, what is one way that you slow down amidst our busy world?
Right now with COVID things, because I think it would be different without COVID, but I love to take off my shoes and go out to our back patio and to just place my bare feet in the grass. It's super grounding for me. Like last week there, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of like tension and some arguments happening, and I just literally went outside and I think I actually laid down in the grass.
Yeah.
And it was really helpful. It was a beautiful day outside. So I would say that, and daily walks. I love going to the park and like walking for 30 minutes or an hour.
I love that. And then who are a couple of your current role models?
I honestly always want to say myself because I'm really proud of myself.
Yes, I love that. We've had a couple people on the podcast say that, and I think it's the best thing. Like, it's so beautiful when we can be like, you know what, I am really proud of myself and I have done some pretty incredible things. So I love that. That's amazing.
Do you want me to give you more than one?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Even if you have any role models around cycles or people that you look up to when it comes to kind of the work you do as well.
Yeah, I will list off a couple. So Claire Baker, she's actually the first one that, even before I started my own work, she was the first person that I saw that was doing work around periods. She has a really good ebook that I would highly recommend. So her, and then I would recommend Alyssa Vitti, who created the app My Flow, and then she also has a really good book from 2013 called Women Code. And I'm pretty sure that she just released a new book this year that I have not gotten my hands on, but it looks really good. The last person that I probably would recommend is the author of Come As You Are, The Surprising New Science That Will Transform Your Sex Life. It's not just about sex, it also has really good scientific knowledge on uteruses and cycles, hormones. And the author of that is Emily Nagoski. She has a PhD.
Awesome. Those are so great. I haven't heard of most of those people, so that's amazing. Thank you for sharing them.
You're welcome.
And then how can we find and support you online?
You can follow and engage with my IG account at Cycle Talk.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's so simple. Cycle Talk.
Cycle Talk. Yeah.
I love it. That is so fun. So thank you so much. This was such a juicy conversation, and we took it kind of all over the place, which I thought was really beautiful, how we kind of dove into some of the, reconnecting to your body and then actually talking about the cycle and the different phases. So I really appreciate that. And for everybody listening, I highly recommend following Cycle Talk and connecting with Jennie further. She's just a wonderful human. And so thank you so much for being here, Jennie.
You're welcome. Thank you again for having me. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Reclamation Podcast. I hope it served you on your own reclamation journey, and know that I'm rooting for you all the way. If you want to learn more about the show guests, head to the website, thereclamationpodcast.com. And if you found value in the show, 5 stars is always appreciated. Good things are coming for you. Bye for now.